Started. It's quiet as a church here. It's nice to be back with everybody. I hope everything is all right there. Are you still on lockdown? Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope everybody is safe and all right and patient in these circumstances. Um, I am going to start with something of a laugh line. I hope you won't mind my making light out of things serious. Give me a moment. I'm just trying to find my PowerPoint here. It should be loading here. Okay. Here we go. I was thinking of calling today's lecture a zombie autopsy. And the joke there, of course, is that it's a little hard to complete your analysis of an election when one side won't acknowledge the results of the election, or when it seems like the election is going to be perpetually re-litigated in the courts and in public opinion. But I do actually think this is not just, or not primarily funny, that it actually has some fairly serious results. And so rather than moving on from the election to talk about other things, I'm going to return today to talking about the election. And as you may remember, last time we were together, I tried to demonstrate to you that Trump actually had very strong support in this election. And so it's a mistake to view the election of 2020 as being primarily about the victory of Joe Biden. It's, I think, better to view it as representing two simultaneous trends. On the one hand, the obvious outcome of the election is that Joe Biden won, and Joe Biden won by resurrecting the so-called blue wall in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, and also by flipping Arizona and Georgia. And so there are some important changes in the electorate that Joe Biden either brought about or took advantage of. And on the other hand, as I noted last week, what we are also seeing is that Donald Trump got more support from the American electorate than any other candidate in American history, with the exception of Joe Biden, right? And so Trump's support did not diminish. It went up significantly after 4 years of Trump in power. And that says something deep and deeply disturbing about American politics, the degree to which we are polarized, the degree to which, in a sense, this election shows the country moving two directions at the same time in geographically distinct regions and for very different reasons. And one of the things I will note, and I'll just say this briefly at the outset, let me come out of the share here for a moment. For a long time in American history, many moments in American history, politics has not been restricted to elections, right? And many of us, I think, admire the moments when politics went outside of the narrow confines of casting a ballot every couple of years and took to the streets. And I think in part what we're seeing with the refusal to accept the outcomes of this election is not only Donald Trump's desperation and immaturity, both as a person and a politician, right? And I want to be clear, that's a big factor in this. Clearly, Donald Trump is unwilling to accept defeat. He perhaps psychologically incapable, also I think practically imperiled by losing the advantages of the presidency. But having said that, I don't think it's him alone. And the fact that, and I'm going to show you some data in a few minutes, tens of millions of Americans are inclined to believe him when he says that the election was stolen from him, indicates, among other things, that simply acknowledging their defeat in an election and moving on does not feel right to many Americans. And there is an aspect of this that we should be sympathetic with. Not that the right way to channel the disappointment, the anger, the worry about what comes in the aftermath of this election is into denying the outcomes of the election. That's not the healthy or appropriate approach, right? But just as we may have been encouraged, had Donald Trump mounted a more serious effort at a coup, right, at illegally retaining power, to turn out into the streets and to do something to resist that, we should not be, I think, wholly critical of those who are registering their frustration with the constriction of politics to elections and essentially being told the election's over, your time is done, right? That they want some avenue for continuing to express their feeling. Here I'm talking about the Trump supporters, right? That they have been neglected in American politics by the liberal elite for 50 years, and that they don't trust that Joe Biden will be any different than anybody who came before him in not continuing that trend, right? I do this on a regular basis. I try to encourage us to think in two ways at once, right? No sympathy, as far as I'm concerned, for Donald Trump, but very important to be able to understand and sympathize with his supporters up to a point at least, and to recognize that there are some areas of commonality to the extent that we admire the protesters of the civil rights movement or the women's rights movement, who didn't just limit themselves to electoral politics, but tried to change the culture through protest politics. It's not entirely different what's coming out of some Trump supporters at this point. Although, unfortunately, Trump, as the leader of this movement, is channeling it into a form of denying reality that at once is distracting us from urgent business and at the same time is deepening our partisan polarization and pushing it into more destructive forms. And so that's where I will concentrate, but I want to start with that initial plea for a certain amount of sympathy with Trump supporters. Now, what is our zombie election, the election that won't conclude, the transition that won't begin, distracting us from, right? And most obviously, it is distracting us from the record-setting rates of transmission of the coronavirus in our midst. And as I've said to you before, right, we look not only at the rates of new cases, which are going up astronomically, right, and showing no sign of leveling off at this moment, we also look at the rates of death and the rates of hospitalization as lagging indicators, right? That is to say that these do not go up as quickly as the rate of transmission goes up, because it takes a week or 2 weeks for somebody who's contracted the virus to get sick enough to end up in the hospital. It may take another week, 2 weeks, or longer if the poor soul is going to succumb for them to succumb, right? And so these are lagging indicators, but at this point, they're all moving up at distressingly, alarmingly rapid rates. And I'm about to show you the geography and the unevenness of this, but we are, after all Americans, right? And so, in a sense, focusing on this at the national level is the most important, and recognizing, right now you are on lockdown. As I've said to you before, I have not seen my mother for almost a year. And many of us have lost friends, acquaintances, relatives, loved ones. This is not just statistics, right? This is a vast national tragedy where the deaths now far outnumber the deaths in all wars that this country has waged, at least the deaths of American soldiers, since World War II, right? And as far as I can tell, other than an occasional brief press conference, primarily focused on vaccines, the White House is really not focused at all on any policy initiatives to cope with this. And Joe Biden, of course, is hampered in his efforts, not that they can really begin until the second half of January, but by the absence of a transition. Now, to focus a little bit more on the geographical diversity, and I would point out that in a sense, what this diagram fundamentally reveals is that the coronavirus is very widespread in the United States right now. It is uneven, but this is not the situation that we encountered in the late winter, early spring, or the summer of this year, in which there were regionally concentrated outbreaks of the virus. It is now all over the country, and that is going to increasingly challenge our public health infrastructure. Many of us are feeling so-called coronavirus fatigue, but imagine how the medical staff of hospitals is feeling as many of them prepare to deal with a third wave of patients washing over them, overwhelming their facilities, right? And unlike past waves, we will not be able to marshal our resources and direct the respirators or doctors or nurses or masks, PPE, etc., to certain regions, because this is occurring all over the country at the same time, and frankly, because we lack the leadership to coordinate in that way. Now, having said all of that, I want to be clear that there are differences at the regional level. This is an article from the New York Times published just 3 days ago, and if you go online, you can actually see graphics that progress over time. I didn't try to reproduce them here. It's too complicated for me, but that show you how, when aggressive measures are taken, you actually see the virus beaten back. And so this is not a demonstration over time. This is a demonstration region by region. And what you see here, right, is the states that have taken the most aggressive containment measures, right, have the lowest rates of transmission of the virus. The states, I'm sorry, that have been the most permissive, have the fewest containment measures, have the highest rates of transmission. Policy matters. Now, the states with the most aggressive measures, there's some unevenness between them, right? And they're not at zero. It's not as if policy is the only factor or totally sufficient to deal with this, right? That is not the case. But clearly policy matters. And this shows, by the way, for hospitalization, that exactly the same trend holds, which is to say the states with more aggressive measures are the states with the fewest rates of hospitals, or the lowest rates of hospitalization. The states in the middle are in the middle. The states with the fewest restrictions have the highest rates of hospitalization. One more way of thinking about this is to divide the country into tiers. The states with the tightest control measures have the lowest rates of transmission. Now, that does not mean that there aren't some states like Rhode Island or New Mexico where the virus is currently surging, but they're clearly not as bad as the states with the intermediary measures of control, where Wyoming is the worst among these. And you can see, right, varying results. Again, the measures by themselves don't tell the whole story. And clearly, the states with the fewest measures are seeing the worst outcomes, right? Again, I want to emphasize that it's not measures alone, right? And as I believe it is the governor of Iowa said the other day, after reversing course, right? Iowa had the fewest controls. The governor has reversed course. And she said, look, we're putting these measures in place. I believe restricting indoor gatherings on Thanksgiving to no more than 10. She says, we're not going door to door and checking to make sure that there are no more than 10 people at any gathering. Um, if a neighbor believes somebody else has 30 people over, they can call the police. But for the most part, we rely on voluntary compliance. And what matters then, I think, is the tone that leadership sets, right? Imposing the restrictions, explaining the restrictions. And again, there's a phenomenon here called peer norming. I've mentioned this to you before. I'll just very briefly summarize it again. If you walk into the grocery store and half the people are wearing masks and half the people aren't wearing masks, you may feel no particular pressure to put your mask on, right? Half the people around you aren't doing it. Why should you do it? If you walk into the store and you're the only one not wearing a mask, not only is it much more likely that somebody is going to say something to you, but it's much more likely that you yourself are going to feel the force of the behavior of those around you. And in certain circumstances, we like those who stand up for themselves. This is not one of those circumstances, right? This is a circumstance in which broad compliance with public health norms produces the best results. And this is why then it is so important that we have not only state level, but also national leadership on this issue, because we do need national policy. We do not have internal borders. And so again, we can impose sequester or stay-at-home requirements on people who move state to state. But if you drive from a state where there's a major outbreak to a state where it's more contained, there's no internal border for you to pass. It's up to you to do the right thing. And we're not going to get compliance with public health norms in the degree necessary until there's national leadership on this. And so again, we absolutely need uniform policy. And instead of talking about this, we're talking about an election that's been over for almost 3 weeks now, right? And so this is, I think, part of the problem. And it does appear that the president is putting all of his focus and all of his energy into trying to alter an outcome he cannot alter, instead of spending the last couple months he's in office trying to combat the virus. I'll say one more thing about this momentarily, and that is that what this means economically is that economic activity will be shutting down again. And I've shared data with you about it before. I'm not going to share a lot of it with you today. But one of the things we see is that when the virus rages, first of all, the service sector closes down. People stop going to restaurants and bars, hotels, travel, etc. Right? And it's already deep contraction in those sectors of the economy, but that as the people whose livelihood depends on purchases in those sectors of the economy lose their wages, their livelihood, they stop spending in other sectors of the economy. And that includes paying their rent, paying their mortgages, eating as much, right? These are not just contractions in spending. This is economic vulnerability rippling outwards. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with retail sales figures, about 40%, I believe it is, of retail activity in the United States occurs in November and December, right? It occurs around the holiday season. Between Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, we spend an inordinate amount of money, and a large portion of it is directed into Christmas expenditures. And this will go way down this year. And so in addition to this being a public health crisis that has killed 250,000 people and shows no signs of abating, it is also a deep economic crisis. part of what I emphasized to you in accounting for the uptick in support for Trump when we spoke last week is that there are just a large portion of Americans who don't have $400 in savings, right? 50% of us have $400 or less in savings. And so what economic contraction means is immediate economic vulnerability for around half of us. And again, we are not paying sufficient attention to both the public health and economic emergency that is overtaking this country while we squabble about the outcomes of an election, the results of which are incontrovertible. So that's the distraction. Now let me transition, and maybe I'll stop just for a moment and ask whether I feel like what I've just said to you is fairly common sense, and we're all paying attention to the news. But are there thoughts or questions about this before I transition into escalating polarization in the country? Anybody who wants to speak, please just push your spacebar. Let me go ahead and unmute you for a moment. Please try to keep the background noise down if you can. So you've been unmuted. Anybody with a question or a thought at this point?
Flossie?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Right in the moment, I remember the first time I left New York City to go to California. The bus driver said, as we crossed the Mississippi River, "Ladies and gentlemen, you are leaving the United States." The same thing occurred when I returned. The bus driver said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now leaving the United States." And this was in the late 40s. The demarcation it was said in fun, but there was that little kernel of truth that still hurts. I leave that with you.
And you put me in mind of the Doonesbury cartoon. I don't know my Doonesbury characters, so apologies in advance. But one of the characters is from the East Coast going to school in Berkeley, right?
Yes.
Probably this is a 1970s cartoon. And she, I believe it's a she, is in the grocery store and has a cart full of toothpaste, right? And whoever she's with says, "I'm pretty sure they have toothpaste in California," right? So the sense, yes, that we've been maybe two countries for a very long time. But having said that, I'm reading, and I've mentioned this to you before. I'm not all the way done. I'm going to be lecturing, sharing my impressions of this book with you in just a little while. But if we can keep it simple to mind, and but okay, where's that echo coming from? So I'm not sure. Let me see if I can figure out where the echo is.
Mute everybody. Mute everybody, David.
All right. That was unpleasant. Sorry. But Michael Tomasky's "If We Can Keep It," right, which is how the Republic collapsed and how it might be saved, is a book about partisan polarization. I've been reading it intermittently while also teaching 18th century political theory and getting ready to give these lectures. But he points out, look, really the period from the late 1940s to the early 1980s is an anomalous period in American history in which there is a real bipartisan consensus that is much more important than the degrees of partisan difference. That we had been polarized prior to that by issues of race. We became polarized again. But that the period in which, Flossie, you're traveling across country, the period in which I'm reading the Doonesbury cartoon, although, yes, there are regional differences, there are cultural differences, there is a sense that California is different from New York, it's not, I think, the same kind of partisan division that we're dealing with right now. And let me start returning to the lecture and giving you some evidence to this effect. I'm sorry, I don't know. Is there anybody else who had a comment at this juncture in the lecture? You can hold your space bar down, I believe, and speak. All right, then I'm going to push on. And so it's funny because Flossie, in a sense, anticipated rather nicely what it is that I want to speak about, which is that partisan polarization is increasingly reflected in what I'm going to call partisan segregation at the state level. And of course, we see this, right? We see this in election maps, red states and blue states. But I want to be as clear as possible about this, right? That what happens in terms of the electoral college distribution at the state level is, in almost all states, with the exception of two, determined by a winner-takes-all system, right? And so California is at one end of the spectrum, right? Or South Dakota, right? Where 2/3 of the population vote for the party that wins the state. But most other states are not that extreme. And even in the most partisan states, there's still roughly 1/3 of the population that is not voting for the side that gets the electoral college votes. But what this map reflects is what I've referred to in the past as trifecta states, right? That is to say, states in which the party that dominates the state controls both houses of the legislature and the governorship. And so this is a stronger indication of polarization because, as I shared with you last week, right, there are a whole bunch of policy differences between states where the Republican Party has exclusive control over the state government and states where the Democratic Party has exclusive control. And this, again, represents the degree to which the parties have come apart over the last 40 years. And right, this shows you, right, that the number of states in which there's divided government, the two parties have to share the institutions of state government and work with each other to get something done. That has declined by roughly 50%, maybe a little bit more than 50% over this period of increasing polarization and partisan sorting. And of course, the big winners in this have been the Republicans, who have almost quadrupled their share of unilaterally controlled states. The Democrats have gone up and down, and they're up a little bit maybe from where they were 20 years ago, but they're about where they were. And to be clear, last time we talked about this, it wasn't to me entirely clear how this would affect redistricting. It now is clear, right? And that there are a whole bunch of states. Some of these states are either not controlled by a single party, or else they're under court orders, or they've passed legislation or referenda that don't allow for partisan districting. But there are a bunch of states where partisan redistricting can still occur, and the Republicans did very well in those states, right? And that's not an accidental correlation, right? Those states in part don't have nonpartisan districting because the Republicans were in power already and resisted those measures. And so the Republicans will be able to engage in partisan districting, gerrymandering in a way that will affect 188 seats in Congress. The Democrats, a very small portion relative to the Republicans, 47 seats. And that is then not only a outcome of the degree of polarization we have, but something that is likely to feed into further polarization. As I've already spoken with you about, when you carve out safe seats for your party, what happens over time is that people appreciate, that the only meaningful electoral contest in the state is the contest to get the nomination of the party that is going to win the seat in that district that has been carved to be safe for this party or that party. And as we know, I've shared the 60-40-20 rule with you before. Roughly 60% in the most recent presidential election, maybe almost 70% of the population votes. In the off-year elections, when there's not a presidential candidate on the ballot, roughly 40% of the people vote. In the primaries, roughly 20% of the people vote. And so it's a much less representative group that votes in the primaries, and they tend to be partisan true believers, extremists. And so when we have partisan districting, we tend to get more polarization, right? And never mind that once we have partisan districting, it itself becomes something that is a source of partisan hostility. It's also an accelerant of polarization. All right, so having just talked with you a little bit about the most direct outcomes of the election, let me pull back and think a little bit about what's been happening in the last week, right? And when we've seen the President of the United States still not acknowledge what seems to be the irreversible outcome of this election. And let me be even less tentative in the way that I put it. There's no meaningful scenario via which the outcome of this election can be legally contested or overturned. You know, what happened in Georgia and Michigan yesterday, what will happen in Arizona and Pennsylvania over the next few days will make this irreversible, right? The states will certify the outcomes. That will determine who the electors to the Electoral College are. And then the Electoral College will register its votes with Congress, and Congress will determine that the next president of the United States is Joe Biden. But nevertheless, Donald Trump is trying everything he can do to reverse the outcomes, and it appears that the Republican Party is sufficiently cowed, even after Donald Trump has lost the election, to be unwilling to contradict the president's efforts to cast doubt on what's occurred. And so I have two images here, and the first I'm referring to as the Surreal, and I almost feel badly showing this image of Rudy Giuliani at this infamous press conference, the second consecutive infamous press conference I believe he's held, in which he is making allegations of widespread fraud. Now, please note that Rudy Giuliani is the president's chief lawyer, litigating these issues, and the charges that he's making in a press conference, he is unwilling to make in a court of law. And there was a very clear case in a Pennsylvania court. Do I have it right? It might have been an Arizona court, I'm sorry, a week ago, in which he used the word fraud. And the judge immediately questioned him. Do you mean fraud? The motion that you've put in front of this court does not allege fraud. And Giuliani immediately walked back his rhetoric away from fraud. He did that for a few reasons. The first is because there is a technical legal definition of fraud. And when you make that allegation in a courtroom, you have to be able to provide evidence to support the allegation. Second of all, courts have standards of evidence. It's not enough to say, I heard somebody say this. You have to produce the evidence that actually backs it up, right? It can't be hearsay, the chain of custody has to be protected, etc. And third if you raise an allegation that has a technical meaning, as fraud does, and you cannot produce the evidence, and it's obvious that you should have known in advance that the allegation was unfounded, there are legal consequences for the lawyer, right? Including fines, jail time, and disbarment. And so what we're seeing, I think, and I'm referring to this as surreal, is a lawyer representing the president of the United States saying in a press conference things he will not say in a courtroom because he knows he cannot support them and would be punished for bringing these allegations, right? And so that's the surreal. But having said that, while courts won't lend any credibility to these allegations, unfortunately, it does appear that many Republican voters, in fact, are. And so I want to be careful in interpreting this evidence, right? And so what we see is that 75% of Republicans in the aftermath of the election are saying that they are not confident that the election was fair and accurate. That's right, basically more than double the average rate for voters, and considerably higher than independents, more than triple the rate for Democrats. And please note that all three groups were closer together prior to the election, although Republicans were more likely to mistrust the outcomes of the election. And just in case you were curious, when we look at 2016, I view this as kind of both half empty and half full, right? On the one hand, the idea that basically a quarter of the population was not confident in the outcome of the 2016 election is worrisome, right? That's a high percentage of the population. But the fact that the party that lost the presidency was basically almost as confident as the average voter or the party that won indicates that there wasn't a sharp partisan skew. Whereas now there's this very deep partisan skew, and clearly this is what the president hopes to accomplish. I don't think because he has any viable path to holding on to power, but I believe because it serves both his psychological needs to not be perceived to be a loser by the people whose adoration he seems to depend upon, but also because I think he thinks it will be instrumental in launching him for whatever comes next after he leaves the White House on January 20th. And to be clear, it seems to me that there's a good likelihood that he will continue to try to play kingmaker in the Republican Party, that he may even run if he's well enough in 2024, and that he also is likely to launch some kind of media enterprise. Having a high level of support from his natural constituency, and a support that says this man is not, quote, a loser, which he lives in this binary world in which either you're a winner or a loser, but someone who was robbed, who was cheated, is going to assist him in doing all of that. Now, I want to be clear, and some of you may have seen the Jane Mayer article in the New Yorker. There's another possible scenario here, which is that Donald Trump will spend much of the next few years defending himself in court and trying to salvage his business empire as he faces increasing debt of a kind that it's not clear he's going to be able to actually renegotiate, as opposed to having to pay down, and that's going to be very difficult for him to do given what we understand from his tax records. Now, in addition to what has been going on in the courts and on Twitter and in PR about trying to contest the election outcomes, we saw something else that I think is much more disturbing. Maybe I shouldn't be comparative. Very disturbing over the last week as well, and really just the last few days. And as you're probably aware, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, gave notice to the Federal Reserve that the Treasury would no longer make available to it after December 31st funds that were being used by the Federal Reserve to backstop the credit of states and medium to large size businesses, right? And so if we continue to struggle economically, as we almost certainly will, if there is any issue of liquidity for state or local governments or for medium to large size businesses, the Federal Reserve having the capacity to be a lender of last resort buoys the confidence of markets and allows banks to loan with reasonable confidence that the Fed has their backs, right? And this is absolutely essential to the economy sputtering along until the vaccine becomes widely available. More good news on that front in the last week, and a really good, I think, indication that the vaccines are going to be very effective, and that maybe by the summer of 2021, it will be safe to resume something like normal activity once everybody who is willing to take the vaccine has access to it. And so we have another 6-8 months of difficult times to navigate. And we clearly need greater economic support. I've shown you data about what the CARES Act has done for the American economy, the way in which it increased rates of savings, the way in which when people had the support of the CARES Act, they were able to not only pay their rent and feed themselves and put gas in the car and cover their medical expenses, but actually were able to save. This was clearly good for the economy as a whole. And one of the, I think, deep concerns about Mnuchin's maneuvers here is that he is trying to, as I put it in the slide, sabotage the economy as the Trump administration leaves office. And let me just be as clear as possible about this. I think that we may get more evidence about what the legal and statutory requirements were on Mnuchin and whether or not he had flexibility. It does appear that the Federal Reserve thinks he does, and a large number of Democratic legislatures think he does have that flexibility to allow Treasury's money to remain with the Federal Reserve for longer. But the background to all of this is the sense that in 2009 and 2010, Republicans in Congress refused to support President Obama and Democrats in Congress in trying to be more aggressive in stimulating the economy. Now, there were people within Obama's own administration, like then Treasury Secretary Rubin, who also pulled back. And so there's blame to go around on this. But the other thing we know is that for the last 6 months, as the CARES Act expired and as it became increasingly clear that COVID was going to continue and get worse, the Republicans also blocked the effort by the Democrats in the House of Representatives to offer an aggressive extension of stimulus and aid to American families. And again, Donald Trump and his administration seem to have no appetite for resuming these negotiations. And so the concern here is that we're seeing something that we've seen before, which is, and Mitch McConnell was very clear about this in 2010, 2011, that his chief aim as the majority leader in the Senate was to make Barack Obama a one-term president. And let me just unpack for you what that means. That means if doing what is good for the economy, what is good for the country, what is good for their constituents will result in a Democratic president getting some credit for the economy rebounding, for people's living situations being better than they would otherwise be. Republican politicians, the leadership of the Republican Party, is not going to do this because it is not in their partisan advantage. And so when I speak of deepening partisan polarization, part of what I have in mind is a kind of polarization that lets politicians rationalize doing things that are bad for the country and bad for their own constituents in the name of short-term partisan advantage. And that is a truly, obviously dangerous development. When partisan rancor gets to the point where people, for the sake of partisan advantage, are willing to do things that are bad for those they represent and the country as a whole, we are in some trouble. Now, let me continue giving you some evidence. As I say, I'm reading about this. I want to be able to speak with you about it more. I've got plenty to share already. And so I've shown you, right, the growing gap in perceptions about the fairness and accuracy of the election, and that this has become much more extreme in 2020 than it was in 2016. I meant to say this, and let me be as clear as possible about this before we move on, that one of the things that we seem to have learned from this most recent election is that people don't always tell pollsters what they actually believe. And so I do think one way to interpret what Donald Trump is doing, and I don't think it's the best or the only way to interpret it by any stretch, is that he is poking us in the eye one more time on the way out the door. He knows that the liberal elite, the liberal media, the Democrats are deeply troubled by the assault on the integrity of the election, that's the kind of thing they care a lot about. And so he's going to do it just to be able to goad us one more time, right? And it might be that a certain number of people who are answering this question by saying they're not confident that this was a fair and accurate election are doing the same thing. We might want to take some of this figure with a grain of salt. I'm not sure about that, but I do think that it might be, at least as reality sets in, right? And please note that more and more foreign governments, more and more corporations, slowly but surely more Republican elected officials are acknowledging the reality of Joe Biden's victory. As that comes clearer, maybe also more rank and file Republicans will. But having said that, let me just see something here. That's where I wanted to go next. The way in which partisanship is skewing our perception of reality, in particular social reality, right? And social reality is a little tricky, right? Is there, now you can't see me. Let me see if I can get myself back. Is there a glass in my hand, right? You know, well, what made that noise? How is he drinking if there's not a glass in his hand, right? The objective reality around us has a way of running into us if we don't acknowledge its reality. There's a famous moment in the history of philosophy when Bertrand Russell is hearing a presentation by someone who's defending a kind of skepticism about the objective world, and Bertrand Russell, rather than responding, walks up to the podium and takes a swing at the man making the presentation, and he gets out of the way, right? And Russell says, that proves that you believe in reality. But social reality is not quite as objective as everyday reality. And so what this diagram shows is perceptions of the economy. And I'm going to get my face out of the way again, right? And what you can see is that with the election of Donald Trump in November of 2016 and his ascension to power in early 2017, you have a radical change in Republicans' perception of the economic health of the United States, right? And arguably, there are some improvements of the economic health in this country as the stimulus of the tax cuts of late 2017 take hold. But please note that that's not what drives the change in perception, right? The perception changes in the immediate aftermath of the election. And please note that in this period in which arguably the economy is getting better, Democrats' perceptions of the economic health of the country keep going down, right? And look at, right, how bad it becomes in late 2020. And we don't have the data yet, but I'd be willing to bet you come Joe Biden's inauguration, right, this figure is going to go way down, and this figure will come up again gradually. And so all of that to say, right, when it comes to interpreting economic health, when it comes to interpreting how effective public policy is, when it comes to understanding how well the country is assimilating immigrants, right, how good race relations are, how prevalent police violence is, yeah, there's data, there's statistics. I try to share a lot of that stuff with you because I do think it's important to do a deep dive into the stuff that is fairly objective to make sure that our intuitions are correct. But most people, frankly, don't do that. And one of the disturbing possibilities of increased partisan polarization, combined, of course, with a new media environment in which we are increasingly segmented into non-communicating worlds of information transmission, right? You live on the Fox diet, or do you live on the MSNBC diet, right? And there's no overlap on the menus of those two competing diets. This is exacerbating what is already a deep problem with this partisan skew in social perception, and it makes it very hard for us to talk to each other. Now, I'm going to just leave you with a couple thoughts. One thing that I think we need to think about after what's happened in the last week is really, I guess, the last 3 weeks is where do the Republicans go after Trump? And last week I referred to Donald Trump as electoral catnip, right? That he has this tremendous capacity to mobilize the Republican base. It doesn't seem to occur when he's not on the ballot. That's part of the reason that so few Republicans are unwilling to cross him right now, is that he seems to hold the keys to their future electoral success. But I think it's very unlikely that he's going to be a viable presidential candidate in 2024. I don't know if he'll be completely discredited, perhaps even jailed, as a result of what's waiting for him when he leaves Pennsylvania Avenue. But what I do believe is that, unfortunately, Trump's charisma and his populism, his right-wing populism, his nativism, mobilized voters that the Republican Party absolutely needs to remain viable electorally in the United States. And to be clear, I started to make this case to you last week, but when we look at the history of political parties, like the Republican Party, once they have been around for over 100 years, their identity, their coalition becomes relatively rigid. It's hard to revise the basis for your partisan support without risking losing your core constituency. And if you lose your core constituency, you're almost always done as a viable political party. And so what we see in the history of parties is that parties that try to navigate, to change their constituency, just as often go under and get replaced by other parties. And arguably, what Donald Trump has done in a sense is to deeply change the Republican Party, but to do so in ways that allow it to hang on to its core base. And so this is perhaps the best, or maybe even the only viable path for the Republicans going forward. And so this then raises the second question. If the Republicans don't have a good way of moving away from Donald Trump, right, and moving away from what's being called Trumpism, the kind of politics he represents, the nativism, the racism, the politics of resentment and a grievance, running against the institution, against the system, viewing American politics and institutions, including the media and the economy and educational elites, as rigged, as only serving their own interests. If they can't move away from that, how far will they go in obstructionist politics, in trying, in a sense, to continue to create the conditions in which their constituents feel left out, that feel that political elites are non-responsive, that public policy does not see them, understand them, actually do things that improve their situation. I don't know what's going to happen in the Georgia runoff elections. There is a possibility that the Democrats will win both of those seats. And if they do, that they will have a slight margin of control in the Senate. It will be very fragile. Their margin in the House is not much better, right? And so there's some possibility the Democrats will be able to govern in certain respects without Republican input. But I think it's quite likely that the Republicans will win at least one of those seats in Georgia, and then they really will be in a position to essentially veto anything Joe Biden and the Democrats want to do. How far will they go? How much damage to the country will they be willing to do? And then the next question is, do the Democrats have a viable way to hold the Republicans accountable for this, to go over the heads of their elected officials to their constituents and to call it like it is? They are damaging you in order to damage our party, right? And you should be clear about that and hold them accountable for that. I don't know that Joe Biden has the charisma or the talent as a communicator to pull that off. I don't know who else in the Democratic Party does. I don't know if the trends that I've just been showing you about partisan mistrust and lack of shared social reality allow for this. Final question, and this is coming out of this book from Michael Tomasky that I'm reading, is are there ways of de-escalating partisanship that don't run through Washington? That is to say, that don't rely either on the Democrats passing policies that benefit the Trump constituents, the Republican constituents, and in so doing, peel off some of those voters for the Democrats and create a situation in which the Republicans have to compete with the Democrats to do things that are constructive for their own constituents? Or alternatively, whether they will be able to convince the Republican constituents to blame their party if they don't. But all of that goes through Washington, right? That is looking at the leadership of the Democratic Party, the president, the Speaker of the House, who knows whether it'll be the majority leader in the Senate. What Michael Tomasky suggests is that when we de-escalated our politics last time, it was because of World War II and because of the Great Depression, because people fought side by side in trenches, and people stood cheek by jowl in food lines, and people understood that partisan divisions were not the most important or urgent divisions in our country. And what Tomasky recommends is that we need to find ways to overcome the segregation of our society along partisan lines. Will there be efforts to do this in civil society? And I'll just conclude on a thought. We are suffering right now from an unprecedented pandemic. Are there not ways that this could possibly bring us together? Are there not forms of assistance that we could be showing to each other that might allow us to prioritize our common nationality and our common humanity over our partisan divisions? If that's a possibility, then that's something that, in a sense, we need to find ways to do that aren't just channeled through our elected leaders and our efforts to pass policies through Congress, but instead depend upon doing charitable, humane, generous things with and to and for each other, irrespective of what's happening in Washington. I'll stop there. I see I've got a comment from John Campbell in the chat bar, and he says the GOP elected officials are shameful, of course, but I think their behavior is rational in protecting their future voice. Contradicting Trump now would make them persona non grata just when the future of the party is being worked out. And I guess one of the questions here, John, is why does someone go into elected office, right? And obviously the rewards of going into elected office in the United States today are not great. And so maybe it's exclusively because somebody wants power. And in which case the guiding light for how you conduct yourself in office is going to be about preserving that power. But if you also went into office to do things that are good for your country, right? If you've got some commitment to the public good or the public weal, maybe I'm being naive, but if not now, when do you prioritize the good of the country over the good of the party, right? We are in the middle of a pandemic that is killing Americans by the hundreds of thousands, right? We're in the middle of perhaps the worst economic contraction in nearly 100 years. So if you prioritize calculus of power over that, I guess it says something about the kind of politician you are as well. I don't know, John, do you want to respond to that? I'm opening the floor, which means I'm unmuting you, which means I'd ask you for the next couple minutes to try to keep the background noise down. Let's see if we get an echo chamber or not. You are unmuted. And Marion, you want to start us out? Go ahead.
Yeah. Last week when you spoke to us, you said that the Republicans that had voted for Trump were a little bit ahead in their economic position. And I really don't know where that happened. I don't think they got many jobs. I don't think the outsourcing changed. And I wondered who you were actually referring to. It's not just the people that go with his charisma, but the people that actually benefited in terms of their bread and butter situation. What are they doing and how did that happen?
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. And I have to be careful here. The data is a bit all over the place and a little hard to interpret. I was looking at some data before I gave the lecture last week that suggested that the counties that moved in the Trump direction had seen increases in employment and income in the first 3 years of the Trump presidency. Obviously, everything goes out the window once the virus hits, right? But so that was what I was reporting to you. But to be clear, and again, you know, I'm reading multiple sources and they point in different directions. But Donald Trump did very little of what he promised to do in terms of populist economics, right? He lowered the corporate tax rate dramatically. He lowered the tax rate on the most affluent significantly. But the benefits from his economic policy to the remaining members of the American public are very limited. And there's some countervailing evidence, and I haven't frankly been able to sort out why it is that the evidence points in both directions, that the people who suffered under Trump went for Biden. And so I'll have to get back to you on that. But I think one of the really interesting questions is, were people supporting Trump because they believed that his economic populist message, right? Keep immigrants out, keep China from taking all of our jobs and flooding our market with their cheap manufactured goods, that was really going to improve their economic situation. There's a classic finding in ethnic conflict research, which is that oftentimes people are willing to suffer damages if the result of their suffering is that those that they consider to be their rivals or their enemies suffer even worse, right? And so is the attraction of Trumponomics, I'm not even sure there is such a thing, but the kind of populist Trumpian economic message, really that we think we're going to do better, or that we are just happy to push back against the globalist educated coastal elite and say up yours to them for a while? And maybe Trump did enough of that he satisfied his constituency and actually increased his support on the part of white working class people in the United States. Yeah, good question, Marion. Thank you. Yeah, Suzanne, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just taking off from where I think you were going. One thing is for people on the Biden side to try to be understanding, but there's a question of whether we can expect the same from the Republican side. What evidence do we have, given that they have stuck with Trump? And so why do it?
All right. So let me try to answer that question on two tracks, right? And so I'd start by saying, let's not assume that all the Trump supporters are in fact fully on board with everything that Trump says. And again, I think we have to be honest with ourselves about the technical political science speak here is heterogeneity, the differences within a coalition, right? You know, you may support Gavin Newsom because you were happy with what he did with gay marriage in San Francisco. I may support him because he's an environmentalist. Somebody else may support him because he's a handsome guy, right? You know, there are different ways that people come into a coalition to support a politician. And I'm not saying that every Trump supporter is amenable, if the Democrats reach out to them, to becoming a Democrat. Obviously, that's not the case. But that there may be a subset of the Trump supporters who, if the Democrats actually did things that were good for them and in so doing discredited the Trump populist line, that they would come over to the Democratic side. And by the way, if that's a 10% of the Trump electorate, that puts the Democrats in a position to dominate American politics for quite a while. And so it doesn't have to be that many. Here's the second then part of my response. And I in a sense throw the question back at you. What's the alternative? If we give up on basically 50% of America, if we decide that they're so far gone that we can't even talk to them, then we, in a sense, become very much like what I'm accusing the Republicans of being, which is to say, we're just playing power politics to try to shut them out. And believe me, I would like them to be shut out, not because I'm a partisan, I don't believe, but because I think it's in the public good that the Republicans not rule right now. That this is actually an article John Campbell sent me from the New York Review a few months back, that the Republicans have shown themselves not really to have a vision of the public good that includes roughly half the American population, right? And so they should not be in power, given that they are going to do things that are bad for a significant portion of the American population if they do gain power. But we can't keep that party, these leaders, Mitch McConnell, Steve Mnuchin, Rudy Giuliani, Donald Trump, out of power unless we convince some of their supporters that they are mistaken to think that the other side doesn't care about them at all, that we're trying to change the country so quickly to being something so hostile to their interests and so alien to their worldview that they're going to be completely left out. You understand, if that's what you believe, why you fear the other side. We've got to convince them that that's not where the Democrats want to take the country. That makes sense. And so in a sense, it might be an uphill battle, but the alternative is so bad that we've just got to try to fight that uphill battle. That's where I come down on this. All right. Thank you, Suzanne. Anybody else with a final comment for today?
Well, this is Matt, and I'm thinking that one of the reasons we have this problem with the silos is that we've changed the rules on TV from the fairness doctrine so that we now have terribly partisan TV shows. And my experience has been.
But you're telling me what I'm seeing. I know what I'm seeing.
Oh.
I'm asking you, what can I do about it?
Nothing. You can't do anything.
So.
Sorry, let me try to ask everybody to just one more minute is all we got. Let's let Matt finish his comment and then we can have our back conversations. And we're picking everything up right now. Go ahead, Matt.
My point is that I run into people who are in the other silo and I try to talk to them. And I find I don't get very far arguing with them about facts. I just ask them where they go for their information. And that surprisingly often shuts people up.
I didn't hear it all.
Yeah, okay. So you're saying, and I think I heard two things, right? The first is the end of the fairness doctrine has a lot to do with the degree of polarization in our media right now. And I'm going to say yes and no, right? I mean, and the end of the polarization doctrine coincided with a couple things happening at the same time, right? FM radio coming online, and the result being that all of a sudden all this airspace on the AM radio opened up, and talk radio took over, right? And that probably would have occurred in something like the form that it occurred, irrespective of the fairness doctrine, and cable news coming online, right? And so we going from there being 3 or 4 channels to there being a couple hundred channels, right? Again, it's not just the fairness doctrine, it's the transformation of the technology. And then of course, the coming online of the internet and social media, right, which is not regulated at all. You know, and we could change that, but it would be very difficult to impose the kind of regulation that the fairness doctrine represented, right? But having said that, you are also saying basically, yes, that it's the media that drive the polarization. And I think you're absolutely right that it's worthwhile noting, right, that of course Donald Trump is the first reality TV star president and the first Twitter president, right? You know, he fired the Secretary of Defense on Twitter, probably the 50th person he's fired on Twitter since he's been president, right? And what a strange world we live in where that's the way official business is conducted. But having said all of that, and again, topic for another day, yes, we need to figure out what the 21st century social media alternative to the fairness doctrine is. Some way of trying to stop the spread of disinformation from being so easy, so fast, right? Where lies circulate, you know, much more quickly than the truth does. And so that's a real problem we need to be thinking about. And, you know, I think it has to be said, Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube did a little better in 2020 than they did in 2016. They did it in part by violating their core business models, and they probably won't do that for long or do that repeatedly, but it might open some possible avenues to regulating the media. Having said all of that, right, that the media is not entirely generating the reality. The reality in part is being generated by, and I've spoken with you about this before, I'll speak with you about it again, the rate at which gender relations changed, the rate in which demographic change occurred in the country, the disappearing of manufacturing jobs, right? And these are things that aren't just about the way the media spins it. They're harder truths about our social world that feel threatening to a lot of people and then make them prone to believe conspiracy theories or buy into Fox Media's effort to affirm their sense of self or, heaven forbid, believe QAnon conspiracy theories because the world feels like it's out of control. So there must be something dark and sinister going on, right? One of the big lessons of media studies is developments in media don't occur out of thin air. They track changes in our social reality. And so if we can change our social reality to be a little bit less hospitable to these dark theories, those dark theories may have less of a hold on us. All right, everybody. Good as always speaking with you. I didn't hear the answer, but I assume that you're probably still on lockdown. Is that right? Yeah, no, oh, you're out?
Yeah, we're not on, we're on relaxed, not locked down.
I'm relieved to hear that, but please do continue to be safe and careful. I will see you all next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Peritz.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.